Some of the laws directed towards combating the virus itself. And a lot of this new law is combating the economic fallout from the COVID-19 lockdowns. And that part, despite months and months and months of Republicans being the ones screaming about the economic ramifications of lockdowns, the provisions dealing with that fallout are the ones that they voted against because they said they shouldn't be in the law. Those are the provisions. Those are the reasons why the Republicans, literally all of them, refused to vote for this new law. I just find that obviously mind-boggling.
I am so damn tired of being lied to. I don't think I can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies, but I'm not gonna buy it anymore.
Hello, my friends, and thank you for listening to the 232nd episode of Congressional Dish. Let's assume it's 232. If it's not, I think you'll forgive me. But basically, this is Jennifer Briney. I'm your host of Congressional Dish. And if this is your first time listening to this podcast, this is a podcast about Congress, what they do with our money and in our names. I am not a member of either political party. I basically don't trust any of them. And so I started reading congressional bills and watching a lot of C-SPAN just to see for myself what was going on. And I was just finding that there was a lot that was happening that I wasn't finding information about anywhere else. And so I am creating the podcast that I want to exist in the world. And this particular episode is going to be about where our tax money is going, specifically due to the law known as the American Rescue Plan. This is the Biden administration era's version of COVID relief. And over the last year and a half, I have read every single COVID related law. And so we're just continuing with the pattern. And so that's what I'm going to tell you about today. However, as much as I like to keep my personal stuff out of these episodes and save it for the thank you episodes, because we do have two different kinds of episodes here on the main public feed of Congressional Dish. There's main episodes, which are numbered. And then there's thank you episodes, because this is a listener supported podcast and everyone that supports my work gets to be heard in the thank you episodes. That's where all the producers get to share your opinions, either about the show or about topics. I actually love the thank you episodes, and that's where we do the personal stuff. But at the beginning of this episode, I do feel like I do need to give you an update on what's going on with me personally real quick, just because I know that my Talking Fat audience, I do host co-host another podcast about weight loss with my friend Jonathan Oakes. I know that a decent number of you also listen to Talking Fat and are aware of what has been going on. And since I don't know when I'll be able to release the next episode, I do feel like I should update you now. So essentially, the reason why this episode is, first of all, there should have been 2 episodes in May. I was only able to produce 1. It's because 2021 continues to be one of the worst years of my life. Oh, man. I'm going to get through this real quick. But basically, in mid-May, a couple days before Mother's Day, my husband's grandmother, who is based out of Seattle with the rest of his family, she passed away. And that was the weekend that I was intending to work on this episode. And so we ended up flying up to Seattle to grieve with the family over Grandma Jean's death. She made it to 99. She had a good run and she was a great lady and I loved her very much. And so we came up here and we spent some time with the family and, that was great, but it did put me behind on the episode. Then I came back and I was already scheduled to watch my nieces the following weekend. And so I did that. And the day that I reunited them with their parents, my sister actually invited us to go to Palm Springs. So the reason I was watching the kids is it was my sister's anniversary. And so her and her husband went to Palm Springs. And then there was a fire in our neighborhood. And so we thought that the smoke was going to come into our neighborhood. And so my sister called and she's like, can we just not deal with wildfire smoke? Like, just bring the kids to Palm Springs. You can do your episode out here. And so that was our intention. And I was going to produce the episode from a place with cleaner air, heat, a pool, and my nieces. That's what we intended to do. So I drove the kids out to Palm Springs, and our first night there, I was getting ready to go to bed. I got a call from my husband who told me that his father, my father-in-law, had a heart attack. His father-in-law is based out of Seattle as well. And so the next morning, because it was already too late to catch a flight, but the next morning, Joe flew from LAX to Seattle. I flew from Palm Springs to Seattle, and we've been in Seattle ever since. So it is now the 1 week anniversary of the heart attack. His dad is still in the ICU, and that is very frustrating to me today because we thought he was going to be moved out, but there was a setback. I'm telling you this because it's obviously thrown my life into total chaos. But while I'm recording this episode, you'll probably hear dings on my cell phone. Almost always when I record this, I silence everything. But for reasons I think you can understand, you might hear the dings because I'm going to keep monitoring what's going on. And if I need to run, I'm going to run. But because of fucking COVID reasons, they're only allowing one person in the hospital at a time. And so there's also a feeling of helplessness. You know, we get to see Joe's mom at night, and they've taken shifts on who gets to see Joe's father every day, but they're only allowing one of us in per day. So we can't even switch off in the middle of the day. It's one person per day. I'm so sick of this COVID shit. But yeah, it's a very frustrating situation. So you might hear the dings, and this is going to affect the production schedule going forward because after I'm done with this episode, I have to fly back to Los Angeles tomorrow and pack up everything we own because my lease ends in 6 days. And because of all of this flying back and forth to Seattle and unexpected just health emergencies, I have 6 days to pack up all my stuff. And yeah, there's a lot going on. And then after I pack it up, I'm driving right back to Seattle where Joe and I are going to basically be living indefinitely while we figure out what the hell is going on with my father-in-law. So if you're the praying type, we can certainly use them because it's been, you know, we'll have one good day and then one bad day. And yesterday was a really good day and today's looking like a really bad day. And yeah, so we could use any prayers that you have, and I could use your patience because I know that there's a lot going on in the world. I'm seeing, okay. See, this is what I'm talking about. I'm getting a call. I'll be right back. Okay, I'm back. Everything's fine. I mean, all things considered, everything's fine. But yeah, so that's basically what I'm telling you is that I'm producing this episode right now. And then I really don't know when I'm going to be able to get back to work because I'm essentially moving to Seattle. So yeah, keep us in your thoughts, and your patience is appreciated, especially you producers, because I know that you want and expect more episodes than I'm able to give you right now. So thank you so much for your patience and support. All right. But now getting into Congressional Dish things. And I should also warn you that I may seem more testy than usual because I am. So, yeah, just pardon my attitude, but my emotions are all over the place lately. And I think you can understand why. So one of the things that I do want to do before we get into this episode is I do need to correct a mistake I made. You know that it is my policy to correct my mistakes right up front so that you know when I screw up, I build trust, and this is how I do it. And one of the mistakes that I made that was pointed out by a producer is that in episode 230, I introduced an exchange between Senator Angus King of Maine and a witness. And I said that it was going to be a conversation between two people who were more Republican than not. But it turns out that Senator King, who's an independent, actually caucuses with the Democrats, not the Republicans. And I have no idea why my brain, and it wasn't like, oh, that was just a mistake out of words. Like, no, my brain really thought that Angus King was on the more Republican side, and that when it comes to independents in the Senate, it was like Briney is the blue one and King is the red one. And like, no, they're more blue than they are red, both of them. So I apologize to the people of Maine for misrepresenting the caucus of your senator. Okay, so now let's get into the American Rescue Plan, which is the COVID relief that was signed into law in mid-March. Now, this bill, which became law, was introduced on February 24th in the House of Representatives, and it passed the House just 3 days later on February 27th. And let's just take a beat and acknowledge that 3 days is not enough time to fully read and digest this particular bill. Because this wasn't the longest bill I've ever read, but it wasn't short by any means. It was hundreds of pages, and not like the typical bill pages that have huge margins and take like a second to read. No, these were like real pages, book pages. And so irresponsible governing with the party leaders writing bills and expecting most of our representatives to vote on them without fully examining them or having a role in writing them, well, let's just note that that behavior is continuing in this fully Democratic Party controlled Congress. But anyway, the bill passed the House of Representatives 219 to 212. Not a single Republican in the House of Representatives voted for it. And there were two Democrats, Jared Golden of northern rural Maine and Kirk Schrader of middle Oregon. Those were two Democrats that also voted against it with the Republicans. Now, Jared Golden parroted Republican complaints about the bill, calling it wasteful and full of unnecessary spending, preferring that the bill only focused on unemployment payments, vaccines, and testing. That's it. But Kurt Schrader explained his vote to television station KGW8 in Oregon on March 1st, and here's why he said he voted no.
A number of very huge problems. Number one is there was no legislative process. I mean, we were presented with 1.9, not allowed or encouraged to offer amendments. I think two amendments got in accidentally, one of which was, at least I know for a fact, expunged in the Rules Committee. The voice of the elected representatives not heard in this package at all. It was a take it or leave it approach. And $1.9 trillion, every other COVID package that we've done, not only has been bipartisan, but has gone through an extensive vetting process, before, during, and after it came together. Why are we not allowed to represent our districts? There's a ton of stuff in here that has nothing to do with COVID, nothing to deal with the emergency at hand.
Now, you know that I get really upset about the way Congress passes bills, so I'm not disagreeing with him about this one. But to say that the other COVID bills were passed in any way properly, what is he even talking about? The CARES Act was 335 dense pages and available for senators to read for less than an hour before their vote. And then the House of Representatives, as you may recall, had already been sent home by Nancy Pelosi, so our representatives in the House didn't even get a chance to vote on it at all. So I don't know what the he's talking about when he says that the other bills weren't passed like this. They were passed like this. In fact, some of them were worse. But for those in opposition to the American Rescue Plan, and you heard it even from some Democrats, the line was that this bill was stuffed full of stuff unrelated to COVID. I heard it over and over and over again and went into this project of reading the bill expecting a bill full of hitchhiking its way into law. I was expecting a real Dingleberry Fest based on the common wisdom. But anyway, after the House vote, the bill then moved into the Senate where it passed, but on a margin of 50 to 49. Once again, no Republicans voted for it. It was unanimous opposition from the Republican Party. But the version that passed the Senate was different from what passed the House because the senators decided to remove a provision from the House version that would have increased the minimum wage from the immoral $7.25 an hour or $15,000 per year, where it is now, to $15 an hour or $31,000 per year. Because you see, the corporate titans who prefer to be able to pay peasants almost guaranteed poverty wages and have us taxpayers make up the difference with welfare since no one can comfortably live off of $15,000 per year. Well, the corporate titans who love corporate welfare, paying for their labor, clearly still have their hands clasped firmly around our senators' balls, and they got the provision for fair paychecks taken out of the bill. Specifically, Inspire Brands took credit as the senatorial ball squeezers because Inspire Brands is the company that owns Jimmy John's, Arby's, Sonic, Dunkin's, Buffalo Wild Wings, so a company that pays wages. And it sent its employees, a report that brags about using their lobbying power to keep their paychecks low. The letter said, quote, "We were successful in our advocacy efforts to remove the Raise the Wage Act, which would have increased the federal minimum wage to $15 and eliminated the tip credit," unquote. Can you imagine getting a letter from your boss bragging about being able to pay you poverty wages? What a slap in the face. And even though they bragged about it, I'm positive there were other food service corporations involved in the lobbying, even if I can't name them responsibly the way I can with Inspire Brands. But in 2020, food and beverage corporations spent over $27 million lobbying Congress, paying 384 lobbyists, 73% of whom are former government employees. And that money successfully convinced senators in both corporate parties to keep our minimum wage slightly above the poverty line. There's only a $3,000 difference between a full-time minimum wage yearly salary and official poverty in the United States. And so they convinced our senators to allow our taxes to be spent on welfare to make up the difference. Although the Republicans don't even want to allow that. But regardless, the minimum wage increase was removed and the bill then passed the Senate. And so, since bills have to pass the House and the Senate in identical form to become law, the bill then went back to the House. And so on March 10th, the final bill passed the House of Representatives 220 to 211, which means that it got a little bit more support. One more Democrat voted for it than the first time. That Democrat was Kurt Schrader. He's the Democrat you just heard explaining his vote against the first version. But he voted yes the second time, which seems to indicate that his real problem with the original version was the minimum wage increase. So here's Kurt Schrader again.
The minimum wage increase was ruled out of order by the parliamentarian, and we did it anyway. The rules don't apply to us. And I'd argue respectfully, as a small businessman for 30 plus years, there's not a small businessman or woman out there that thinks raising the minimum wage in the middle of a pandemic when we're trying to get them to hire people makes good sense, particularly in struggling restaurant and hospitality industries. That makes no sense at all.
Which I just wanted to play for you so that you understand that these people that we've hired to represent us, they identify as the people issuing the paychecks. They identify as the bosses, not as the people receiving the paychecks. They don't identify as workers, which is why we keep getting fucked. But he ended up voting for the final version of the American Rescue Plan without the minimum wage in it. And the only Democrat who joined all of the Republicans to vote no was Jared Golden of Maine. And then the bill was signed into law the next day by President Biden on March 11th. And the thing about the American Rescue Plan that I just think I even have to note up front is that nothing in here makes me truly mad. You know, a few things in here made me go like, and I'll highlight those for you today. But all the stuff worth knowing, I'm not truly angry about a single thing. And I think that's the most notable aspect about this law, which I read in detail, every word, expecting it to be full of dingleberries based on its reputation. Because like long-term producers, can you testify for the next thank you episode for all the newbies, how rare that is for me to read a law that spends a metric shitload of money, in this case, almost $2 trillion, passed under emergency circumstances that doesn't have any infuriating dingleberries? I mean, even during COVID, listen to the CARES Act episode. There were unnecessary tax cuts for rich people. There was the redefinition of small business to include huge businesses. There was a dingleberry favor to drug companies to make their products easier to get approved. That's the type of garbage I almost always find in these laws. And I didn't find any of that here. Nothing even close to that major. And the truth is, it doesn't make for great podcasting. In a sick, selfish way, I love finding the dingleberries because it gives me a juicy story to break. But as an American citizen who is truly exhausted with being enraged, this bill was a breath of fresh air because this law is going to help a lot of us peasants. It already is. And the only big picture downside is that it has to spend a lot of tax money to do so. It's going to cost us $1.9 trillion in tax money. And there's been a lot of fuss made over that total. So like, here's Kevin McCarthy, the top Republican in the House, in a short YouTube video he produced, which was full of lies about the law. But here he is talking about the spending.
So the Democrats just passed the single largest spending bill in American history. $1.9 trillion. Let's see, 1.9, 0, and another set of zeros. $1.9 trillion.
Oh, so dramatic. And here's Mitch McConnell, the top Republican in the Senate.
Let me just repeat what you've heard from virtually every Republican in the House and Senate. This is a wildly expensive proposal. largely unrelated to the problem.
But let's put the overall spending in this law into perspective. Yes, $1.9 trillion is a lot of money, no doubt about it. But it's pretty close to the amount of money that we're committed to investing into just one kind of fighter jet for the military, the F-35. Congress has already authorized over $1.7 trillion to be spent on those lemons. In fact, Congress funded 17 more of them last year than the Defense Department requested. The F-35 program is looking more and more like a welfare program for Lockheed Martin shareholders, and the funding level for those planes is pretty damn close to this law. But where the F-35 money is being spent on fighter jets that will be used to kill people, the American Rescue Plan money will be used in ways that are clearly going to help American citizens. And so let's look at the spending hierarchy first, from the largest chunks of cash on down, and you can judge for yourself if you think this stuff is totally unrelated to COVID. And I'll give you my opinions, but my opinion doesn't matter, and you know that. So, first, the largest chunk of cash is almost $362 billion, and that's going to go to states and territories. Of that money, almost $220 billion is going to go to states, territories, and tribal governments. Now, the states and the territories and the tribal governments are pretty much always included in these provisions. And so I'm just going to say states from here on forward, but just know that territories and tribal governments, they're included. But the states can give the money that they receive from this money bucket to citizens, small businesses, nonprofits, and industries that were crushed by the COVID lockdowns, such as industries as tourism and travel, to help them make up the financial damage that they experienced during the COVID emergency, the health crisis, and the lockdowns. The money can also be spent on government services in amounts equal to what the governments couldn't collect during the pandemic. Because when the citizens and businesses who pay taxes couldn't work, well, then they couldn't pay as much as they usually do in taxes, which meant that the local government's budgets got slashed. And in this particular emergency, most of which was purposely not managed by the Trump administration at the federal level, well, it was the state and local governments that used their tax money to set up testing sites and now vaccination sites. And they paid for all the people and equipment needed to do so. And so the revenue shortfalls the governments experience due to the double whammy of extra work and less incoming money are filled in by this law. And because this emergency caused maintenance on essential government services to be postponed, the money is also allowed to be used to, quote, make necessary investments in water, sewer, or broadband infrastructure, unquote. The states are also allowed to use this money to provide premium pay, so that's up to $13 an hour, capped at $25,000 per person total, to people who were deemed essential workers and risked their own health to keep working during the pandemic. The money is not allowed to be used to pay for tax cuts or to deposit into pension funds. And then on top of that, $220 billion for funding at the state level, there's also $130 billion for cities and counties that can be used for the same exact purposes with the same exact restrictions as the state level funding. Now, I already played you a short clip of Kevin McCarthy's video, so-called informing people about the American Rescue Plan. And here's what he said, and his Republican co-conspirators told the American citizens about this section of the law.
$350 billion to blue states. In fact, less than 9% of the entire $1.9 trillion goes to fighting the virus. The rest of it is a payoff for Pelosi. Well, let me just show you. $600 million goes to San Francisco.
Which is so deceitful that I count it as a lie. First of all, this money isn't just for blue states. I have a document from the Treasury Department in the show notes for you proving that every single state in our union got at least $500 million. So $500 million for every state. It was an even amount. And then on top of that, each state was given additional funding based on how many people in that state are unemployed. The Treasury Department also had a report on how much each city got in funding. San Francisco got about $454 million, not $600 million. Even if you add San Francisco and South San Francisco together, it's not even $500 million. So I don't know whose ass Kevin McCarthy pulled that number from. But here's some other cities that got funding measured in the hundreds of millions of dollars, including red as blood Louisville, Kentucky, getting $239 million, New Orleans, Louisiana, $311 million, San Antonio, Texas, can't call them blue, getting $326 million. How about Dallas, Texas, $355 million. And St. Louis, Missouri, $439 million. And then there's cities that got even more money than San Francisco, like Cleveland, Ohio, got $511 million. Baltimore, Maryland, $526 million. Houston, Texas, another Texas on the list, $607 million. Detroit, Michigan got $826 million. Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, about $1 billion. Chicago, Illinois got $1.8 billion. And New York City came in at number one with $4.25 billion. So much for a payout to Pelosi. And as for his lie that only a small fraction, what did he say, 9% goes to fighting the virus? Well, who the fuck do you think has been in charge of fighting the virus for the entire year? States, cities. By funding them, we are funding the virus fight because for the vast majority of the COVID emergency, the federal government wasn't really doing anything. Ventura County created the drive-up testing sites where I got my COVID tests. Ventura County paid the staff members who stuck the stick up my nose. Ventura County took that booger stick and sent it to the lab to be tested. Ventura County contacted me with the results. Ventura County arranged for my vaccine appointment. Ventura County rented the abandoned Kmart to create the vaccination center that I went to. Ventura County paid the staff who checked my ID, gave me my shots, and then kindly didn't laugh at my old ass for almost crying about the needle. Ventura County paid for all the protective equipment that was there for those nurses and EMTs working at the vaccination center to keep them safe. And then Ventura County followed up to make sure that I did all of that a second time. The feds in the Trump years, they handed out the money that Congress appropriated to private companies who mixed together the vaccine recipes invented by our government scientists at the National Institutes of Health, and then told the states to do the rest. And so paying the states for their services, that fucking counts as fighting the virus, at least in my mind, because they're the ones who did all the work. States and cities also know which businesses were hit the hardest by the lockdowns. You know, do we really want all our small businesses closing down because of a pandemic they didn't cause? Because of lockdowns that they didn't order? Is that really what we want? Because allowing our businesses to close and our citizens to go broke will crush our tax base and make all of our communities less safe because of all the humans that will end up living on the streets, in addition to the offensive number of humans that are already there. Anecdotal, but I drove through my old neighborhood in Los Angeles on the way to LAX after Grandma died a couple weeks ago, and there are tents all over the park across the street from my old apartment. They were never there before. I also drove through Venice Beach, which has turned into a giant homeless encampment. It's the worst I've ever seen it, and it wasn't that great to begin with. But the lockdowns, which were clearly a part of the pandemic experience, they have clearly made things worse, which it was the Republicans that were pointing that out. And so do we really want to do absolutely nothing about the economic fallout in our local communities? Was this emergency only medical, or was it economic too? And I think the answer couldn't be more obvious. And so, after refilling the states' and cities' bank accounts, the next largest chunk of cash goes to education-related funding. Because you may or may not have noticed, but our schools have been closed for either some or all of the last year. And so this law provides about $165 billion for education. $123 billion of that, which is going to be available only for the next 2 school years, is for public schools, including charter schools, which are public schools managed for a profit. But public schools can spend that money on what they determine that they need it for. But that said, at least 20% of the money has to be used to address learning loss via summer programs or extended school days and school years. The rest of the money, 80% of it, can be spent at the local district's discretion for activities that they're already authorized to use federal tax money for, and to fund measures needed to protect students and staff from COVID, which seems to me to qualify as being necessary to fight the virus to prevent it from infecting our nation's children. There's also a little under $40 billion for colleges, and then an additional $3 billion for private schools with, quote, a significant percentage of low-income students, unquote, which is not at all specific. And so basically, private schools can get their hands on this money. But I'm not about to freak out over less than 2% of the education money going to private schools because they need hand sanitizer, masks, and classroom redesigns too. Next on the list, we get $50 billion-ish for COVID testing, which is directly fighting the virus by finding out who has it. And there's also $50 billion that's going to go to refill FEMA's account. And FEMA is the Federal Emergency Management Agency. First of all, FEMA has been involved in direct virus combating activities, running federal vaccination centers that were created after a president who gave a damn was sworn into office in January. But bigger picture, does anyone think that FEMA's account should have remained empty? Oh, wait, apparently yes. Apparently the entire Republican Party in the U.S. Congress. That said, there is one thing in the FEMA part of the law about funerals worth knowing about because it's a permanent change. And I'll go into detail about that in a few minutes, but just know that we have refilled FEMA, and that's a good thing. But let's keep going with the financial priority list, because next on the list is $42.5 billion for childcare. Because how are parents supposed to go back to work if their daycares have gone out of business? You know, the Republicans lately, and I'll get into this a little later too, but the Republicans in power, not just in Congress, but all over the country, are claiming that the reason that companies are having trouble finding peasants to come to work for them is because unemployment payments are just too damn good. The peasants aren't financially desperate enough, apparently, and so the Republicans think that the solution is to starve us of funds so we have to go crawling back to our corporate masters. But for so many people in my peasant life, one reason the adults aren't trying to get jobs yet is because it's almost summer and someone has to watch the kids. Schools in my neighborhood are only partially reopened. And if the kids are in school at all, because my sister's kids aren't, but for the ones who are going to school, they're only going part-time, 3 days a week at most. And for the parents with even younger kids, daycares are either completely booked, that's been a problem in my family, or some daycares have gone bankrupt. And so, the American Rescue Plan provides $24 billion to save childcare businesses by giving them money for employee salaries, benefits, and recruitment, gives them money for rent or their mortgages, gives them money for PPE and training, and for mental health support for the children or the employees. There's also $15 billion, which is only available through September of this year, for childcare money for states to provide childcare funding to healthcare employees, emergency responders, and, quote, other workers deemed essential, unquote, regardless of their income levels during the emergency period. So basically, we're going to take care of the kids, of the people who are actually getting us through this pandemic. And then last, there's $3.5 billion for states and territories to pay for childcare at their discretion. And this is another category that can only be described as unrelated to COVID if we are pretending that there is no economic emergency going on. Along those same lines, the law also provides over $41 billion for housing for American citizens, because while this does provide money for already homeless people, there are millions of Americans who couldn't pay their rent because they lost their income during the pandemic lockdowns. And you would think that the Republicans, if they meant a word that they said in 2020 about how damaging the lockdowns were, would have at least some empathy for the people that couldn't work because of those lockdowns and who therefore couldn't pay their bills. Housing people doesn't directly combat the virus, I guess that's true. But if you are at all concerned about the economic fallout from the lockdowns, which the Republicans said they were, then you would think economic recovery would be a priority. But Kevin McCarthy and Mitch McConnell and the sheep who follow their marching orders in Congress, you heard it. They treated provisions like this being included as if it's some kind of scandal. Along those same lines, this new law provides $32 billion for small businesses, which the Republicans also say they care about. It includes $15 billion, which does not expire, for the Small Business Administration to make loans to businesses with fewer than 300 employees in low-income communities. There's $10 billion to bring back a 2008 global banker-caused financial cluster program designed to save small businesses. And there's over $7 billion more for the PPP program, which is pretty famous at this point. You should probably know what it is. But if you don't, and if you want to know the details about the PPP program are in the CARES Act episode. The new law also provides over $31 billion for public transportation, which is not allowed to be used to privatize any of our public transportation systems. I was happy to see that in there. But public transportation systems are another category that, sure, does a train directly combat the virus? No. But the economic fallout of the lockdowns that the Republicans were so concerned about, well, these lockdowns hit public transportation systems hard. But now, how are peasants supposed to get to work if they don't have cars, don't get paid enough to afford cars, and now don't have buses or trains either? If you're a shameless corporate hack who cares only about businesses, this priority should be welcome too. It's basically a publicly funded corporate welfare program, allowing city corporations to get cheap labor from the suburbs. Anyway, moving on, there's then a little under $1 billion for restaurants and performance venues, with the vast majority of that going to restaurants that don't have more than 20 locations or are stock market companies. The restaurants can use the money for expenses from February of 2020 through the end of this year. And I know for a fact this money has saved restaurants already. Again, another expense that isn't directly combating the virus, but instead is combating the effects of the lockdowns, which were the result of the virus. But getting back to directly combating the virus, there's over $18 billion specifically for community health centers, with almost half of that reimbursing them for all the testing, contact tracing, and vaccine distribution that they've done. The everything our local communities have done to combat the pandemic, while the Trump administration pretended that COVID was a hoax. And $3 billion of this money is for mental health and substance abuse care, which I also consider necessary because we all know people who just boozed their way through this pandemic. There's also $18 billion for airlines and contractors that don't fire their workers before September 30th. And we've seen this before because since the beginning of the pandemic, this is the weird way that Congress has funded a backdoor unemployment program for airline employees, essentially paying the companies to keep them technically employed, even if they're doing nothing in empty airports all day. I do also want to note that there's money for airplane manufacturers in here, $3 billion, which smells like another Boeing subsidy to me. Because those who listened to the CARES Act episode will remember that Boeing got themselves, I think it was a $17 billion dingleberry in that law. That number might be off and I don't feel like looking it up, but it was a lot of billions of dollars and there's a few more billions in here for them too. And I can't say it's specifically going to Boeing, but Boeing's an airplane manufacturer in the United States. So, I guess that could be considered a non-COVID related dingleberry, but not one that actually pisses me off. I just, couple billion here, couple billion there. After reading the NDAA about defense contracting, I can't get that mad about anything that's measured in less than $100 billion based on how much we waste on war here in the United States. But this next one on the list is not a non-COVID related dingleberry. It is $15 billion for veterans healthcare, speaking of the military, which is clearly necessary during a pandemic. But I must tell you, that most of that, 14 out of the $15 billion, goes to the CHOICE program, now labeled the Community Care Program, which is the privatized veterans healthcare program that I highlighted in episode 161 in 2017. And I put the link to that episode for you in the show notes if you haven't heard about it yet. But basically, this program allows veterans to get their healthcare in the private sector. But before this program, our government-funded veterans healthcare system had to be administered only by public servants at the Veteran Administration and not by doctors working for a profit. Now, this program is controversial. It has been since the beginning, and so this was a sneaky way of funding it. But that said, the leftover $1 billion will go towards making sure that veterans don't have to pay any copays or out-of-pocket expenses for COVID-related expenses between April 6th, 2020 and September 30th, 2021, or until that single billion runs out. Going back to even more direct virus combating money, there's $14.5 billion for vaccine creation and distribution. Great. And there's $10 billion that can be used through 2025 to use the Defense Production Act to buy or create needed medical supplies and equipment to combat the COVID pandemic. After September 30th of 2022, though, so that's a year and a half from now. Less than that, but you know what I mean. But money left in this money bucket will be able to be used for any activity, quote, necessary to meet critical public health needs of the United States as determined by the president, unquote. And so, depending on how much money is left in this money bucket, it could turn into a bit of a healthcare-related slush fund. But again, okay. I prefer Joe Biden be given money for healthcare stuff than, the 10 more F-35 airplanes of death that we could afford with that amount of money. There's also $9 billion-ish available until September 30th, 2022 for international health programs, quote, to prevent, prepare for, and respond to coronavirus, unquote. The State Department, though, gets to pass this money out, and I see some fuckery potential. For example, there's almost $1 billion for, quote, activities to address economic and stabilization requirements, unquote, resulting from coronavirus, which is super broad. And stabilization is often tossed around in regime-changey conversations. But the thing is, I have no way to track where that State Department money will actually go.
And that's all I have to say about that.
Let's see. There's also $8.5 billion available until fully spent for healthcare providers for, quote, healthcare-related expenses and lost revenues that are attributable to COVID-19, unquote, and which is basically back pay for direct virus combating services that they already performed for us. There's also $8.5 billion for COVID, housing, and education support for Native American communities. There's $8 billion more for airports with the same requirements as the airlines that they don't fire any employees before September 30th. So that's, it's that unemployment system by another name. There's also $4.5 billion for energy expenses for low-income people so that those who are out of work don't get heat stroke or freeze to death because they can't pay their private monopoly utility companies. Another expense that is a response to the economic fallout from lockdowns that the Republicans screamed about for a year. There's also $4 billion in here to protect food supply workers from COVID, which again is a direct COVID combating expense. And there's another one, $1.4 billion for COVID-related expenses of senior citizens. And then finally, last on my list is $1.4 billion for the $1,400 stimulus checks for middle and low income American citizens. And there were other expenses measured in the millions. And if you're interested in those, you can find out more about those by using my plain English outline of the law that you can find in this episode's show notes. The links next to each section will take you to the page where that section starts. And so please use that if you want more information or need details about how any of these programs work. And if you need to know if you're eligible or how to apply, going straight to the law is a really good way to do that. And my outline on this is really detailed. So please know that that's there for you if you need it. Now, there were also provisions that didn't have dollar amounts attached to them. And I'm going to tell you about some of those next. But obviously, this list of financial priorities is incomplete because I don't know how much will be spent on all these things. And I don't know how much money the government won't collect because of them, which is the case for all of the tax credits. But I think what you can see is a pattern here. Some of the laws directed towards combating the virus itself. And a lot of this new law is combating the economic fallout from the COVID-19 lockdowns. And that part, despite months and months and months of Republicans being the ones screaming about the economic ramifications of lockdowns, the provisions dealing with that fallout are the ones that they voted against because they said they shouldn't be in the law. Those are the provisions. Those are the reasons why the Republicans, literally all of them, refused to vote for this new law. I just find that obviously mind-boggling. But now let's look at some of the provisions likely to affect our lives, starting with a day off. And so if you haven't gotten a COVID vaccine yet, if not dying or losing your ability to smell bacon forever due to COVID isn't enough of an incentive to get a vaccine, perhaps a day off will pique your interest. Because if you're self-employed, the new law allows you to get a tax credit for up to 10 sick days, capped at $200 per day, if you're getting COVID tested, quarantined, or if you're getting the vaccine. You can also get a tax credit, also capped at $200 per day, for family leave if you're facilitating a family member getting COVID tested, recovering from COVID, or getting them a vaccine. If you're someone who does have a corporate overlord, your boss is also able to get a tax credit capped at $511 per day for 10 days, or family leave capped at 2 months at $200 per day for the same purposes. And so don't let your bosses tell you they can't afford to let you take the day off for any of these things, COVID testing or vaccines. The government is covering that expense for them. The catch is that you have to take the days before September 30th, which means that you should start the vaccine process by mid-August in order to maximize your vaccine and chill days. Another provision that I know is causing a lot of excitement amongst the groups of adults who absolutely hate it when I call them breeders is the child tax credit. Because starting in July and going until the end of the year, taxpayers with kids living in the United States who make under $150,000 per year will get payments that by the end of the year would total $3,600 per child under the age of 6 and $3,000 for kids aged 6 through 17, which shakes out to be about $250 a month for the big kids and $300 a month for the littles. And it does seem fair to me to give parents a tax refund like this, considering that our public school system just zoomed it in for a full year. Personally, I think there should be a babysitting auntie tax credit, but, life's unfair. Here's the key, though. To get these payments, you do have to file a 2020 tax return, regardless of if you owe anything. So get that done because you'll be rewarded with thousands of dollars for your troubles. There's also a new temporary tax benefit in here for parents who make less than $400,000 a year, which is most of us, who pay for childcare in 2021. So basically, you can get half of your childcare costs covered up to $8,000. So essentially, you spend $8,000 on childcare, you're going to get $4,000 back. And if you have more than one child, this is capped at $16,000. So you can spend $16,000 and get $8,000 back. Now you just have to find a daycare that still exists and has availability.
And may the odds be ever in your favor.
Another provision is forward thinking and is going to help low-income parents during the next emergency without the need for a rushed multi-trillion-dollar dingleberry fest. Now, back in March 2020, a few weeks before the CARES Act, the Families First Coronavirus Response Act said that during 2020 and 2021, if a school is closed for more than 5 consecutive days under a public health emergency, families of children who get free or discounted school lunches would be able to get benefits valued at least as much as the school meals to be distributed via the food stamp program. So basically, you get money on what are called EBT cards. This changes the dates so that's valid in, quote, any school year in which there is a public health emergency declaration, unquote, or, quote, in a covered summer period following a school session, unquote. But it's the any part of those sentences that ensures that during the next emergency, this will automatically come into effect so that children of parents who work full time but only make that $15,000 a year will still be able to eat thanks to the corporate welfare that is necessary in this country because we allow corporations to pay us so little for our work. Speaking of corporations paying us very little for our work, right now, like I said before, empowered members of the Republican Party and Republicans alone all over the country are refusing to pay unemployment benefits provided by this new law in order to make workers so financially desperate that they come back to work, regardless of if they are fully vaccinated yet or not, or if they have anyone to watch their kids. Because the American Rescue Plan extended unemployment benefits through September 6th, including an extra $300 a week because most unemployment programs, which are run by the states, only provide a fraction of the workers' usual wages. And some states, hello, southern states, provide only a small fraction of a worker's usual wages. But as of this recording, 22 states run by Republican governors have told the federal government that they won't accept our tax money for those that remain unemployed in their states. Even worse, in some of those states, they're refusing any unemployment payments at all to self-employed and gig workers because providing unemployment to those groups was never required in any of the previous COVID laws. It was just allowed. And so the Republicans in power are cutting off workers, voters, from unemployment payments in their states, regardless of if demand has picked up for their services. And this is anecdotal again, I know, but I went to the Cheesecake Factory the other night and got a table on the patio without waiting. The patio, which had half its tables blocked off. The kicker is that it was 6 p.m. on a beautiful, warm Saturday night in cold-ass Seattle. Now, in normal life, waiting 0 minutes for a table on a half-closed patio on a Saturday night would be impossible. And so we are clearly, you can see it out in the world, we are clearly not back to normal life or a normal economy yet. The idea that all businesses are right back to where they were and the idea that they need as many employees as before COVID is simply ridiculous. But Republicans are bending to the demand of their corporate masters and cutting off unemployment payments anyway. And I am not guessing about this being a demand of big business. The Chamber of Commerce, the lobbying organization for big business, has been openly pushing for their not just Republican servants, but all their servants in lawmaking positions to starve us peasants of funding so that we will crawl back to our corporate daddies in desperation as soon as possible and work for as little as possible. The Chamber of Commerce actually said, quote, one step policymakers should take now is ending the $300 weekly supplemental unemployment benefit. Based on the Chamber's analysis, the $300 benefit results in approximately 1 in 4 recipients taking home more in unemployment than they earned working, unquote. And shame on corporate America if that's actually true. But it appears, based on the data, that while it's possible that a quarter of our workers are paid so poorly that they make more on unemployment than they do slinging purple meat at Arby's, the data doesn't back up the claim that that's the reason that so many Americans remain on the unemployment rolls. because the jobs that are being created and filled the fastest are actually those low-wage jobs. The ones that the $300 per week would theoretically encourage us lazy peasants to stay on the couch and avoid. But no, those jobs are being filled, according to the chairman of the Federal Reserve, Janet Yellen. She would know. The jobs that are not being filled are the higher paid professional class jobs. Those are the ones that are lagging behind, which makes perfect sense to me because I personally know working women, almost all women in my personal life, who aren't going back to the office yet because there's no one to watch their kids. As long as Zoom school in summer remains a thing and daycares are closed or full, as I know many are in my community, the parents with the financial ability to do so are staying home with their kids. The truth is that the Chamber of Commerce is against unemployment payments, period. They were against them after their banker members crashed the global economy 10 years ago, and they're against unemployment payments now. Their corporate members want us financially desperate so that we will work for anything. And they can have that opinion. Who cares what they think? The tragedy is that they have an entire political party, one of the only two with any real power in this country right now, that they have paid off so entirely that the entire party is now fully captured by and serving corporate interests. The rest of us be damned. The Chamber of Commerce has ranked number 1 in lobbying money spent for the last 4 election cycles, which are the only election cycles I can get data for right now from the Center for Responsive Politics. But in 2020, the Chamber of Commerce spent almost $82 million lobbying our lawmakers to do what the corporate masters want. And the Chamber of Commerce members passed out over $900,000 to lawmakers directly. 75% of that money went to members of the Republican Party. And some of the lobbyists that the Chamber of Commerce has on their current payroll, hired to walk around Congress and convince our lawmakers to do things like cut off our financial lifelines, well, they include former Congressman Robert Livingston, who was a Republican lawmaker for over 20 years, and Michael Mukasey, who was the Attorney General of the United States during the George W. Bush administration. In total, the Chamber of Commerce, so big business, has 130 lobbyists roaming the halls of Congress on their behalf, with 59 of those having worked inside Congress at some point in time. That's the kind of money and power that American workers are up against. And in 22 states, Republican Party members have already delivered workers a huge loss, ignoring data and clear as day reality about our economy in order to do the bidding of their corporate masters. And the only advice that I have for workers in those 22 states is to remember that they cut off your financial lifelines early on purpose. And in the next election, stop voting for Republicans. If you collect a paycheck, they are clearly not on your team. They work for your boss, who wants you to work for as little as possible so that they can pocket the difference. And this law makes that so clear. But as for the unemployment payments that you did collect, the American Rescue Plan makes sure that unemployment payments up to $10,200 will not be taxed. So that will keep a little more of your limited funds in your pocket. And I'm clearly fired up about this. This podcast is named Congressional Dish because, well, for a couple reasons, but one of them is I was a waitress for 13 years. And so on a personal note, if you're getting your payments cut off because your restaurant doesn't have any customers, I am just so sorry. You know, I really wish this wasn't happening to you, and I wish I had the power to change things. I'm feeling very powerless in every way right now. You know, you guys have been jerked around for over a year. And when I say you guys, I include all of us in this because any of us could have been in your position. But with each of these COVID laws, we've seen them cut off unemployment payments crazy early, leaving you to deal with the anxiety and stress that comes from not knowing if you can pay your bills while you wait for the next congressional clusterfuck of a bill or for normal life to return. You didn't cause this pandemic, and yet you're literally paying for it, and it's unfair. And I just want you to know that this former waitress sees you. I know the jobs. I know the customers aren't there yet. And it's just wrong this is happening to you. You know, if I had the dictator powers to fire every one of the Republicans in power who are trying to drive you into financial desperation, you know I would do it. And it's the helplessness, the knowing how many people their policies hurt, and yet watching them get reelected time and time again by the very people they're hurting. I don't know what to do about that. And I don't know what to do about that. And so I'm just really sorry. And I just hope this country changes and just figures out who the Republicans are. And I don't think you should have to read the bills to do it. It's very obvious to me with what I do for a living. It's baffling to me that it is not obvious to others. But then I've watched Fox News. I know the lies. So I'm just really sorry. Moving on. I told you I'm in a mood today. Moving on, there is one more provision aimed at people who have been unable to work because of the pandemic. And this provision is going to help you guys at least get health insurance. Now, clearly, this is a better way too late than never situation. But the American Rescue Plan does allow anyone who qualifies for unemployment payments in 2021. So you're eligible for this, even if your asshole Republican governor cuts off your checks. But if you are unemployment eligible according to the federal laws, you can get the most generous subsidies available for health insurance regardless of your income level, which means your out-of-pocket limit is reduced by 2/3, and the insurance company will have to pay 90% of your healthcare costs. Now, again, this is only for 2021. This is temporary, but enrollment is currently open at healthcare.gov and will remain so through August 15th. Another thing the American Rescue Plan does to help us peasants is that it temporarily, again, so this is only for 2021 and 22, but it makes health insurance coverage not included in our tax investments like in other countries, but at least makes it a bit more affordable. Again, temporarily. But for this year and next, people with incomes at or below 150% of the poverty level, which is $19,320 a year for individuals, which are people paid $9.28 an hour, which is significantly more than the minimum wage, and yet they're only at 150% of the poverty level. But people paid that little by their corporate masters can get health insurance coverage with no monthly premiums. And so taxpayers will be paying worker benefits that cheap-ass corporate masters get out of paying. So I do consider this corporate welfare, even though it benefits individuals, because we are talking about people who go to work every day. We are talking about people who make more than the minimum wage here, but are super close to poverty, and so they're going to have their health care completely covered for 2 years by taxes, like all Europeans get every single year. And as for everyone else, regardless of our income, for the next 2 years only, health insurance premiums are going to be capped at 8.5% of our income, which I consider an 8.5% out-of-pocket extra tax that simply goes to the private health insurance companies instead of the government, which means that those companies can siphon money out of that tax as much as they can get away with for a profit. And so that's the Democrats' idea of helping workers. Now, you have to acknowledge, or at least I do, I know I'm very opinionated in this episode, but I have to acknowledge that that is better than the nothing at all that the Republicans are offering, but it is still outrageously expensive and overall a health insurance industry gift. And again, it's all temporary. In law, starting in 2023, there will be no 8.5% cap on our out-of-pocket privatized tax for health insurance. And so even to keep this garbage, we're going to have to fight. But the sad fact is that this came too late for over 500,000 Americans who died of COVID and the many millions of others who died in our other recent emergencies. And I told you in the financial rundown part of this episode that this new law fills up the Federal Emergency Management Agency's money bucket with $50 billion, which I'm so grateful for considering the hills I've been COVID hiking in and around Los Angeles are already starting to regularly burn a good 6 months before a typical fire season begins, and hurricane season will be upon us by the time you hear this episode. But there was another part of the FEMA provision that has gotten almost no attention at all, and it is a permanent change, one that I know is controversial in this audience because I asked you about it on Twitter. The change I'm referring to is that starting with deaths occurring after March 13th, 2020, so almost all the COVID deaths, and, quote, for any subsequent major disaster declarations, unquote. So for any major disasters to come in the future, FEMA funds, quote, shall, unquote, pay for 100% of disaster-related funeral expenses. Now, funeral expenses weren't specified in the law, and so that's up to FEMA. And so I can't say that this information is going to be permanent about what exactly is covered because the head of FEMA, which is a part of the law enforcement branch of government, well, the head of FEMA changes with every new presidential administration. But Joe Biden's FEMA is allowing people to get up to $9,000 in tax money for funeral expenses. Now, to qualify, the death certificate of your loved one has to say that the death was caused by COVID-19, and you'll have to provide receipts for the funeral services. Also, any prepaid funeral services don't count. This is only money spent after the death. Anyone can apply for this money, even rich people. And FEMA has already paid out over $15 million from our emergency funds. But so far, at least 174,000 people have applied for this money. Now, as for what will be covered by Joe Biden's FEMA, our taxes will pay for transportation for up to 2 people to identify and take care of the body. We'll also be paying for the gravesite, including the headstone. We're going to pay funeral costs, including the urn or the casket. And caskets are a total fucking racket, averaging $2,000 to $5,000 for a body to rot in the ground in. Now, I've long said that my view of government is that we should use our taxes, our collective investments, for the services that everyone needs on standby. And the question I put out on Twitter and to you now is, do you think funerals should qualify as a service everyone in society needs on standby? You know, like, are funerals a want or a need? And if we do consider them a need, do you then think funerals only for people who die in disaster declarations should qualify? Or is this a totally inappropriate use of taxpayer funds? And so I put the question out to Twitter. I asked, do you think funerals are an essential service that should be paid for with taxes? 408 of you responded, and the results were that 56.4, so a clear majority of you said no. And the comments, of which there were way more than I expected, showed that even for many of the people who supported the idea, the people that said yes, there were reservations and regulations that people wanted to have in place. So, for example, at Franz Ferdinand, great name, responded, body treatment, transportation, and disposal, yes. A funeral ceremony, no. And that makes sense to me. Body disposal, I can see that being a need because let's say someone who is homeless with no family, if they die, we do have to do something with their remains, right? But what about a casket, a priest, and a sandwich platter? You know, then I'm not sure that that is a need. Those could be considered wants. And so this seemed like the most reasonable proposal to me, which was offered by @HanFliesCasual. This person said there should be a public option where you get the basics for burials, a pine box, no plush fabrics, a hole in the ground, and a simple gravestone. For cremations, a simple vase or jar, nothing fancy. I totally think a public option should be a thing for people who can't. And I'm assuming they mean can't afford it. And that idea I could get on board with. You know, I could pay taxes and feel good about contributing to that, but it's the funeral part. And obviously we've been dealing with this a lot lately, and I know funerals help the grieving process. But I used to be close friends with an undertaker's son, and so I've thought about it a lot. And the funeral industry is a total racket. You know, the food is more expensive and the caskets are insane. And that's a concern that some of you also expressed. So here's @RStoneX who said, sure, but I'd also be for more regulation of the industry that has convinced people that they need to unnecessarily lay out $5 to $15,000 or more when a loved one dies. Exactly. We also got this feedback from @LRojoBeard, who said, yes, as with any healthcare, if you want anything extra, like a service of casket upgrade, then that's different. I go as far as to say the personal charges for basic services at both ends of life is pure greed. And so what's clear to me is that our emergency funding, which gets drained very, very quickly lately, is going towards funerals now, which are often religious ceremonies, and the caskets, which are heinous wastes of money. What's clear to me is that this is a controversial idea, and now it's permanent. And I don't think the way that it became permanent, hidden in the middle of a bill like this, is cool. There should have been a debate about this in this country. We should have been given a say. And yes, my emotions around death are running high right now, but we as taxpayers should either pay for funerals or we shouldn't. Because Joe and I have had now 4 family members die in 2021, and only one of those was COVID. And I must admit that I'm struggling to understand why only Uncle Jim's funeral expenses would be partially covered by society. But the deaths of both of our grandmothers and my 35-year-old Eric, who fought cancer for a decade, why do their deaths matter less officially to American society? Like, why don't we get any societal help in grieving for them? I just don't understand why my grandma and Grandma Jean and Eric's funerals all have to be fully out-of-pocket expenses, even though they died in the middle of the COVID year too. It's like they matter less or something. And that's not sitting well with me. And like I said, I haven't heard a peep out in the world about these new provisions, and so I don't think this is well known. And so producers, I would love to hear your thoughts on this in the next thank you episode. But if you have strong feelings, the people who need to hear it are your members of Congress. You have 1 in the House and 2 in the Senate. And if you want to kill 2 birds with 1 stone, feel free to include your letters to them along with your donation if you want to share what you said to them with the Congressional Dish community. But I do think Congress deserves some feedback about this, because this is the most significant permanent change made by the American Rescue Plan. Moving on, another way this law attempts to help Americans with the fallout from the economic damage caused by COVID is through some provisions providing money for housing. The new law provides over $21.5 billion on top of the $25 billion provided by the Coronabus to states that can then use the money to pay rent, utilities, and other housing expenses incurred directly or indirectly to COVID for up to a year and a half. The payments have to be made directly to the landlord unless the landlord doesn't agree to accept the payment, in which case you can receive the money directly. There's also a separate $9.9 billion fund for homeowners that can be used for payments of their mortgages to take their loans out of forbearance, principal reduction, facilitating interest rate reductions, payments for utilities and internet service, insurance, and homeowner association fees. And this money is going to be really important because the national eviction moratorium is in danger of being killed. So on May 5th, in response to a lawsuit followed by property owners who want to evict their residents who haven't paid rent or mortgages in a year, a federal judge basically ruled that landlords and banks are allowed to kick people out of their homes despite the existing federal level eviction moratorium. And right now, there are 11.9 million Americans who are behind on their housing payments and yet still have roofs over their heads because of this moratorium that prohibits landlords and banks from kicking people out. And this was first put in place in September, first put in place by the Trump administration. Let's give credit where credit is due. And it's been extended a few times by the Centers for Disease Control. And the current moratorium is set to expire on its own at the end of June. But the judge ruled that the CDC doesn't have the authority to impose this moratorium, which effectively kills it immediately. However, the Justice Department is appealing that ruling, and so it remains in effect while the Justice Department is working this out. But if the Justice Department loses, we could see an eviction and foreclosure wave starting really any day now. And it'll be a big wave, because since last March, 332,123 evictions have been filed in United States courts. So this wave will be huge if allowed to crash. And the last time we had a foreclosure wave, corporations bought millions of our single-family homes and are now renting them back to us for like quadruple the monthly price. So the vultures are waiting in the wings to do it again, and that will make home ownership even more impossible for my generation and those that are younger. And so this law is attempting to stop the wave by helping our neighbors make up the rent and mortgage payments, but in reality, it's not going well. Because the programs for getting rent payments from the government are again being administered by the states. And so there are 364 different programs for handing out this money, each with a different application process. And one state has an application that's 45 pages long. Another problem is that some states are already running out of money, and so 20 of those programs have already had to shut down because they're out of cash to give. Another problem is that people simply don't know their rights, because the media doesn't like reading and telling us details about things like this. So like I said before, the money is supposed to go directly to landlords. But if landlords refuse to take it, individuals can get the cash directly. Those are your rights. And some landlords are rejecting the payments because they don't want to agree to the terms, which often include an amount of time they're not allowed to evict the resident or jack up their rent. In many cases, after being denied, the resident is just giving up instead of then requesting the cash directly, which is their right and which is such a shame. And so basically, the American Rescue Plan took an important step towards preventing another wave of humans looking for places in parks to pitch their tents, but it's clear that more is going to be needed to be done and soon. Because no matter what the courts decide, the eviction moratorium expires in June, and with the CDC not even requiring masks anymore, it's going to be harder and harder to legally justify their emergency powers to extend the moratorium, if they're kind of declaring the emergency over with their other rules. Congressional Dish is a really happy show, isn't it? Oh, man. And this is a new law that I actually like. Yeah, it can't all be good news, you know? But if you can figure out how to navigate the system, help is there. So I do think there is good news here, despite my attitude about how it's actually shaking out for people. Let's see. Okay, so there's actually one more thing I want to tell you about in here that the courts are involved in, which is that there's a part of the American Rescue Plan that was written by Senator Cory Booker of New Jersey that was intended to help farmers, but is being challenged in court. And that is loan forgiveness for, quote, socially disadvantaged farmers and ranchers, unquote, which is a legal classification for farmers or ranchers who have, quote, been subjected to racial or ethnic prejudice because of their identity as members of a group without regard to their individual qualities, unquote. This classification includes farmers and ranchers who are Black, American Indian, Alaskan Native, Hispanic, Asian, or Pacific Islander. Now, this category was legally created in 1990, but was updated in 1992 to include women, including white women. But the American Rescue Plan goes off of the 1990 version, the original definition. And so white women, white people in total, actually, will be left out of this debt forgiveness program. And so, for this group of people, which essentially excludes all white people, the American Rescue Plan provides, quote, such sums as may be necessary, unquote, which means unlimited funding, for the Secretary of Agriculture to give non-white farmers and ranchers payments covering up to 120% of their debts as of January 1st, 2021, which will pay off loans they received from the Farm Service Agency or Commodity Credit Corporation and other loans guaranteed by the Department of Agriculture. And 120%, that means it's going to pay off more than their actual debts. The extra 20% is intended to cover any taxes that the farmers would have to pay on this, since the debt cancellation payments will count as income. To qualify, none of these farmers have to prove that they were harmed in any way financially by COVID. The qualification is based solely upon race. And the USDA estimates that they're going to use about $3.7 billion to pay off the debts of 14,432 farmers. Now, the debt cancellation program by itself, I don't know, maybe it's not a problem, at least if you're not opposed to debt cancellation in general, but that's another conversation. The debt cancellation of these specific loans, you know, like these loans were never offered to white people, so the government can't forgive loans that they never offered in the first place. And let's be real, white people, especially in farmer America, have had it better than non-white people. We have a very long, ugly, well-known history of racism in this country. And so this program existing and the debt cancellation for the people participating in it, if you're cool with debt cancellation, that's probably fine. It's a whatever for me. But here's the problem. There's no similar loan forgiveness program for loans that were taken out by white farmers. And so there are farmers in this country that are going to have their debts wiped out, and who they are is determined entirely upon their race. And that's racism. That's unequal treatment on the basis of race and race alone. And so therefore, it's being challenged in court. Specifically, the Texas Agriculture Commissioner, Sid Miller, is suing the U.S. Department of Agriculture because he says this provision discriminates against white ranchers and farmers. But his lawsuit isn't fighting for equality. They aren't trying somehow to extend loan forgiveness to white farmers too. Instead, Sid Miller and American First Legal, which is an organization recently created by racist cretin from the Trump administration, Stephen Miller, they're suing to kill this debt cancellation program entirely. And the case is being heard by a George W. Bush appointee who has ruled against equal family leave benefits for gay couples. And so the lawsuit does stand a chance in that guy's courtroom. And then there's a second challenge also being waged against this provision in Wisconsin on behalf of 5 Midwestern farmers who have loans issued by the Farm Service Agency and other USDA-backed loans, whose loans could be forgiven under most of the terms of this provision, except they can't be forgiven because the loans were issued to people with white skin. And so we're going to have to wait and see what happens, because there have been no developments in the lawsuits since they've been filed. But the lawsuits do have a chance of success. And so if you're a non-white farmer or no one that has gotten one of these qualifying farming loans, you should probably apply as soon as the program begins. There haven't been any payments yet. But time is of the essence, because while there is no official time limit on this program, it could get killed in court. That's about it as far as the American Rescue Plan is concerned. And as far as my anger is concerned about it, The only anger I feel is about the perception that I feel was effectively circulated into American society, portraying this law as full of garbage unrelated to COVID. You know, was there a lot of spending in here? Yeah, of course. But unless you consider the economic fallout from the lockdowns as not related to COVID, this bill was remarkably dingleberry free, at least in my opinion. Because, you know, if there was weird shit in here, it would be on my list of things to tell you. But this was it. And so I guess you can judge for yourself. You know how I feel about it. I didn't hold back in this episode, but you can judge for yourself based on the information that I gave you, if this was a COVID pandemic response bill or not. And if you want more details, show notes. They're waiting for you. But clearly, I think it was. And I think that congressional Republicans are a bunch of liars, because I really was expecting to find a lot more in here. Okay, so that's it for this episode. As I explained, probably poorly and incompletely in the beginning, the next few weeks of my life are completely insane. But I do know that as soon as I can actually have a stable place to live, I do know that I have episodes coming for you. So, for example, for this episode, while I was in transit, I did listen to a hearing. It was over 7 hours long about long COVID, which is the health effects that people are experiencing after they technically get better. And what I learned in the hearing is that it is affecting way more people than I ever thought. And I got a lot of details about that. So, you know, I have sound clips waiting about that. And then I do have to, in the next week, drive from Los Angeles to Seattle. So I'm going to have some time in a car. So I'm definitely going to keep working. It's going to be catching up on what's going on in all of these hearings. And I know that there's been some fascinating ones in Congress. So I'm not disappearing, but I don't know when I can do even the next thank you episode, because my mind is just being boggled. I mean, during this episode, I'm sure you heard the dings, but what you don't know is that in the middle of this episode, I paused for about an hour because I got a group call. We talked to my father-in-law's nurse, and he's going to be on the ventilator now for a few more days and stay in the ICU. I mean, we thought he might get out of the ICU today, so it's been a big setback. And I don't know what the fuck is going on. And I don't know if Joe can come with me to pack our stuff. Like, I honestly don't know what's happening beyond an hour or two in my life right now. So again, I appreciate your patience. I know you guys are paying for the show, and I'll get back to this as soon as I can. The next episode, the next time you hear my voice, will definitely be a thank you episode, and I'll fill you in on everything that's happening. I'm still doing Talking Fat every week with Jonathan. So if you care about the personal stuff, that's where you can hear it publicly. I've been completely checked out of Twitter, email, Instagram. I haven't looked at it. I've checked Instagram. I'm lying. Instagram is getting me through this because there are people that send me funny Instagrams about dogs and shit. And and one of them notably being Joe's sister. So every day she's just sending me the stuff that makes her smile. And so, yeah, Instagram it's actually been one of the happier places. But yeah, I'm going through a lot. So I will come back and give you a thank you episode as soon as I can. It's going to be a long one because it's been a minute. But yeah, that's just how it's going to be. But because I have been so understandably checked out, please send me whatever you are seeing about Congress, any hearings that you want to highlight. Although when it comes to hearings, I do make my list from the congressional record. So I do have eyeballs on every hearing. I will know if they take place. But if you're watching C-SPAN or you just find out about something, don't assume that I'm seeing it because I haven't been able to pay attention as much as I usually do to Congress. So if you have a tip, send it my way. It is very much appreciated, even if I don't respond. So yeah, that's what's going on from here on forward. And so I would like to thank some of our new executive producers. Big thanks to our anonymous executive producer of episode 131, Bombing Libya. This was a $1,000 executive producer payment. And along with it, our anonymous producer said, quote, "I think the way you laid that out is one of the most cogent explanations of the democracy we have been bringing to other parts of the world and the resulting hell that follows it," unquote. So Bombing Libya is an episode I produced quite a long time ago, but I feel like it's really still so relevant, especially now with the Biden administration now back in charge, because it was the Obama-Biden administration that did that regime change. And so super relevant. Thank you so much for putting an executive producer credit on it and for that payment. It's really helped because, as you can imagine, flying back and forth to Seattle and living in hotels while paying rent, I mean, it has been an expensive month, along with being a sad and very difficult one. So thank you so much for that payment. You made a huge difference. And I'd also like to thank our new executive producer, who is a longtime producer, but thank you, Michael Constantino, who is going to be the executive producer of this episode. And he said, quote, "I have listened to every episode, some multiple times, and they are just fantastic. I am honored to be a part of the Congressional Dish community and can't wait to see how the show will evolve over the years. Every episode just gets better and better, so I would like to be the executive producer on the next 2 that you make," unquote. And so he's going to be the executive producer for this episode and the one to follow. So thank you so much for that. And this was one of those executive producerships that was built up over time. And so if you want to be an executive producer and have your name on the episode of your choice, it doesn't have to be a one-time lump sum payment like that $1,000 was. You just have to hit $535 over time. And so we do have a lot of longtime producers that are looking at their funding levels and picking the episode that they are proud to have their names on. And I am proud to share the producer lines with you guys. To all other producers, thank you so much for supporting the show and for the moral support that you have sent in, like not just for those of you that found out about our current struggles, but as you know, it's been quite a year. It's just one hit after another. So I just appreciate you guys a lot. And the fact that I'm able to wrap up this episode, be able to spend 6 days packing up everything I own and literally move to Seattle in order to be here for this family emergency, which is now, it's becoming clearer and clearer that this is not going to be a short experience. So the fact that I have the ability to take care of my family like this, that I don't have a job that forces me to be in one location, the freedom this job affords me, I'm very well aware that that wouldn't be possible without you. So thank you for the support. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for everything. You're very much appreciated. So thanks so much. And I will talk to you as soon as I possibly can. Wish me luck with all this shit. I could use it. And more importantly, wish Gary luck. Prayers are needed. Prayers are appreciated. We're not out of the woods here by a long shot. So my father-in-law is simply the best. And, whatever you believe will help, we can use it all. Thank you. And hopefully I talk to you sooner than later. All right. Talk to you later. Bye.
We're surrounded now by liars coming at us through our TV screens.
We don't have a domestic spying program.
They're content to fight in black and white despite the many in-betweens. We got a president who plays with the facts. And then he waves a flag to cover his tracks. As if a lie is alright, if the end will justify the means. Now we are so damn tired of being lied to.
The polar ice caps aren't going away.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it lies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. We are so damn tired of being lied to.
Government jobs consume the profits of the private sector.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. Now we're not keeping quiet.
These bills represent common sense, bipartisan solutions that actually solve problems.